my name is Mary Marcy, and I'm the president of Dominican University of California. And I am thrilled to welcome you to the start of our spring lecture series sponsored by our Institute for Leadership Studies. This series, as many of you know, and many of you are veterans of this series know, it's a staple of conversation and engagement in our community, and it's an opportunity to hear from those who make the news and those who create it. In an era of alternative facts and chaotic information, we go to the source and we invite real conversation and real discussion about real issues. This lecture series has always been a source of pride. It is more important today than ever. Some of you will remember that in December, Senator Bernie Sanders told us of his view that the Democratic Party needs to transform from one led by a liberal elite to one led by working people and young people. Today, we will hear from Chris Hayes, a bright new face in journalism and someone who will share his observations about how a country founded on ideals of equality and social justice now looks like something uncomfortably close to a police state. These discussions are provocative, they're critical, and they're important to have on a campus such as Dominican. We have a student body that we says looks like California and looks like the future of the United States. Our students are wonderfully diverse, incredibly socially active, and eager for conversation. From children of immigrants to those whose Californian roots go back many generations, from those who are the first in their family to attend college, to those who have moved from across the country to embrace new experiences, we find them as students here at Dominican. They live and work together, learn from each other, and they serve our community together. Their shared experiences will inform not only their present but their future actions, and they will help shape our nation. Because of the significance of this series, I am delighted to thank those who enable us to offer this lecture series. It is a partnership with our good friends, the iconic Book Passage with stores in Marin and San Francisco, our own independent bookstore. The series is a program of Dominican's Institute for Leadership Studies, a center for leadership development offering education and training for students and professionals. And a special thanks to the Institute's director and one of the architects of this program, Dr. Denise Lucy. And for the past 7 years, Private Ocean Wealth Management, one of the oldest and largest wealth management firms in Marin, has served as a lead sponsor of this lecture series. Thanks to this support, we have been able not only to sustain, but to strengthen this community engagement experience. So to join us today to introduce Chris Hayes is the chairman and co-founder of Private Ocean Wealth Management, Mr. Richard Stone, who I'm happy to say is also a trustee and a very good friend of Dominican University of California. Richard Stone.
Our guest this afternoon, political commentator and journalist Chris Hayes, successfully evolved from being, because this is a Warriors country, a great bench player to a superstar starter on the MSNBC talk show host team. Mr. Hayes first appeared on MSNBC as a contributor and frequent sub as host for Rachel Maddow's show, The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell, and Countdown with Keith Olbermann. However, at the age of 32, Chris became the youngest host of a primetime show of any of the country's major cable news channels when he moved from weekends to full-time anchor of his own weekend show, All In with Chris Hayes. He graduated from Brown University with a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy, and he earned a fellowship at Harvard Safra Foundation Center for Ethics. He also was a Schumann Center Writing Fellow at In These Times, an award-winning investigative magazine. Chris's essays, articles, and reviews have appeared in numerous publications. In 2007, he became the editor-at-large of The Nation magazine. In 2012, he published his first book, The Twilight of Elites, America After Meritocracy. That book was a prescient analysis of how Americans lost trust in public institutions and could lead to a political crisis. His new book, A Colony in a Nation, Chris analyzes why and how racial inequality hasn't improved since 1968. Today, Chris joins us at the Angelical Concert Hall stage at Dominican and should feel comfortable. He worked with a student theater group in college. His mother was a school teacher, and Chris, in fact, was once the adjunct professor of English at St. Augustine College, an independent institution in Chicago. Chris also is a father of 2 children, including a son, David Emmanuel Shaw Hayes, who celebrated his 3rd birthday this week and probably missed Daddy. Please join me in welcoming from the Bronx in New York to Dominican and San Rafael, Chris Hayes.
This is an incredible turnout for a midday, and I'm going to apologize in advance that I will sign books but then run at 3 because I have to do my show tonight. And I'm already stressing out my senior producer, who was like, could you be here by 3? And I was like, well, I'm going to leave at 3. So she's having a panic attack. I thought I'd talk a little bit about how I came to write this book, and then we take some questions. Does that sound good? Great, okay. So I wrote this book. I started doing reporting on criminal justice as soon as the show started, but at some point I went to Ferguson, the aftermath of Michael Brown's death. And I was in Ferguson when a young man in a parking lot showed me a video on a smartphone that had happened the night before. It was a few days after Michael Brown's death. If you remember the context, that 2 nights after, a local Quickie Mart had been burned down, and then there had been this incredibly intense militarized police showing. And the previous night, on a side street not far from where Michael Brown was shot and killed, this incident took place, and he showed it to me as we talked in a parking lot on his smartphone. And I describe it in the book. I'll describe it to you now. There's some young men and women who are on a front lawn, black, and they're drinking out of red Solo cups and having a cookout on an August night. Something I've done. I imagine everyone in this room has done. I mean, you're not really a red Solo cup crowd, I gotta say. Plastic stemware, I don't know. But you know what I'm talking about at the very least, right? Yeah, okay. Allow me to be your cultural translator. And they're in this front yard. It's dark at night, and in the background, in this sort of blurry, hazy way, you see the whirling blue light of a police cruiser and this phalanx of officers. At first, it's unclear what it is because the officers are silhouetted against the cop car lights, so they're backlit. But as they come in, you can see there's a wedge of officers who are walking down the street in front of the car, and they're walking in this kind of laconic pace. And they are dressed in the kind of riot gear which perhaps you've seen in person or you've seen on television that looks like it was designed by a Marvel Comics artist, right? It's sort of V, this kind of bulge at the shoulders that creates a sort of intimidating V, and the bulge here, and the huge knee pads, and the face gear, and they have their batons, and they're sort of lightly tapping them. And someone begins to narrate the scene into the smartphone from this yard where these people are sitting in their yard, standing in the yard, having a cookout, and they say, well, they're marching towards us, and they're telling us to get inside. And you can hear the bullhorn from the car as it comes closer and closer into focus. And they're telling them to get inside. And some of the people in the yard are getting agitated. They start turning towards the police and saying, hands up, don't shoot. Hands up, don't shoot. And that had been a kind of rallying cry in the days after Michael Brown's death. And once again, they instruct them to get inside the house. Now think for a second about this. This is their yard. The owner of the house says, we're in our yard. This is my property. And the police keep approaching. And the scene gets a little more agitated, and then, boom, tear gas canister. You can see the person holding the smartphone ducks. Bedlam ensues. People are screaming. If you've ever been tear gassed, which I imagine that some of you have been tear gassed, not while drinking out of your stemware. In earlier days, you moved to Marin to get away from the tear gas. It's infuriating, right? It's an assault, and the tear gas is wafting up, and the person whose house it is just furious, and he actually wants to fight the cops. And he's screaming, "You want to come get it? You want to come get it? This is my property." And he has to be restrained by his friends. And here I'm going to use a word I don't use on television. At the end of this scene, after they've been tear gassed on their own yard, the person who's narrating the scene looks into the camera. He says, "Why do you think we say fuck the police? This shit." So I thought a lot about that video. And the reason that that video stuck with me because it was part of a larger phenomenon that I saw in Ferguson where it seemed to me like armed agents of the state instructing a property owner to move off their property and then responding with force was patently unconstitutional, unjust, but in some sort of deeper cultural sense did a kind of violence to our shared principles. I kept thinking about the Gadsden flag, the yellow flag that was adopted by the Tea Party movement starting in around 2010. It's a colonial flag. It's the coiled snake hissing. It says, "Don't tread on me." I mean, talk about don't tread on me, right? So I was thinking about that, and I had started to think about maybe writing about some of this, and I'd gone back to Richard Nixon's Law and Order rhetoric because I was sort of trying to find the point, statistically, empirically at least, at which America's mass incarceration system really starts to expand, and it starts in the late 1960s. It produces the largest prison system in the world. And there are a million different statistics I can give you about the size of this thing that we've created, but I think the best one is that 1 out of every 4 prisoners in the world is an American. Think about that for a second. Just honestly, close your eyes and just think about, try to conjure in your head a prison in Pakistan, in China, in South Africa, in Nigeria, in Canada, in Brussels, in Argentina, in the Netherlands, in France, in South Korea, in North Korea, and on and on and on and on. And imagine that set, and then just think of 1 of every 4 people in the world sitting in a prison cell right now is here in our country. And if you go back and you look at where this sort of inflection point happens in the data that produces this, it's right around the late 1960s. And it's in 1968 when Richard Nixon comes before the convention delegates, the Republican National Convention in Miami Beach, in which the country's on fire. There are riots. There are 2 political assassinations that have happened. He talks about our cities smoldering. He says, tonight it's time for some frank talk about the problem of order in the United States. And he lays out this vision, this argument about the ways in which the allowing order to disintegrate has led to violations of law, was sort of pulling the society apart. And at one point, in a kind of moment of sort of slightly false equanimity, he says, black citizens as well as white, they want the same things. They don't want to just be recipients of state aid. They don't want to be a colony in a nation. They don't want to be a colony in a nation. So I thought about that. And I kept thinking about this idea of a colony, right? And the Gadsden flag. Now, at the time, of course, there's this very sort of fertile intellectual tradition that's being developed in which cross-pollination between American civil rights movements and what at the time are called third world independence movements, right? Post-colonial movements resisting colonial oppression, in which there are folks in the U.S., Stokely Carmichael among others, making the argument that there is a kind of internal colonization, right? In the early 1960s, Malcolm X would call Oakland a police state. But I was so sort of obsessed with this idea of the Gadsden flag that it sent me back to our experience as a colony. And I learned something astonishing in researching the founding of this country, which is that what we learn about the American Revolution isn't quite right. Or at least, it doesn't quite capture what was going on. Because what we learn about the American Revolution is that it was precipitated by taxation, right? No taxation without representation. But the thing about taxation is, taxation then is not the same as taxation now, right? There's no payroll taxes, there's no April 15th income tax deadline back in the colonies. Taxation is customs, import, and export tariffs and duties. That is how the crown is collecting its money. And to take a step back for a second to think about the entire economic logic of the British Empire in mercantilist terms is to subjugate territories and then use essentially tariffs and monopoly grant licenses to extract revenue from them, right? This is, for instance, why the British won't allow Indian citizens to spin their own cloth or make their own salt, right? Because they want to require them to buy these things with the import tariff from the British. Now, the colonies have a situation in which they have to pay these tariffs to get stuff from the Brits, but not only that, anything that you can't get from the British territories is essentially illegal. Well, this doesn't help because, and this is something I learned, the colonies are basically the biggest rum producer in the world. That's what they do. I mean, honestly, a huge amount of the economic activity is rum, and the rum is made with the input of molasses, and the molasses is coming from islands that are not under British control, and so they are being smuggled in, right? There is an enormous smuggling architecture and economy in the colonies. It's actually not dissimilar to the way that, say, a drug trade works in a neighborhood that is, for different reasons, cut off from the legitimate economy, right? The state takes a good, it declares that good illegal. The demand for the good exists still. The demand is met by a black market, right? All of those steps are there in the colonial smuggling economy. A smuggling economy that, let's just be clear, was essentially the lifeblood of the entire economy for all of the colonies. Like, this was the one thing they could make in the colonies. In fact, rum is so important it becomes a medium of exchange in the triangle trade. It's essentially used as currency because you could take a barrel of rum and ship it across the ocean and pay for slaves with it. Now, the smugglers in the colonial times are both powerful, and the customs officials more or less look the other way because they understand that if they were to choke this off, it would essentially squeeze out all the economic activity in the colonies. And when I say these smugglers were powerful and high status, I mean really high status. One of the biggest smugglers in the colonies was a man by the name of John Hancock. Right? So this is the sort of economic situation. And then what happens is the French Indian War happens. And Britain incurs tremendous war debts, okay? And those war debts lead to a deficit, and they lead to austerity, and the king decides that the way that he's going to close the gap in the budget is to crack down on smuggling and tax evasion in the colonies, okay? Again, not dissimilar to the war on drugs, right? You have this black market. It's a vibrant black market. And it's producing tangible benefits for the people that are engaged in the trade of it. And it takes really intense draconian crackdown to stamp it out. In fact, ever-escalating measures of that. The customs officials start enforcing the customs law like never before. They inaugurate what I call in the book the first stop and frisk era. I want to read you how people interpret this at the time. This is John Adams, who's reflecting back at the end of his life about what were called the writs of assistance, which were essentially grants of total latitude and authority to the customs officers to search anyone, anywhere, at any time. And he says, the writs of assistance enable the custom house officers to command all sheriffs and constables to attend and aid them in breaking open houses, stores, shops, cellars, ships, bales, trunks, chests, casks, packages of all sorts, to search for goods, wares, and merchandise which had imported against the prohibition. The colonists hate this. They start fighting back in different ways. One way is mob violence. Customs officials are beaten in front of everyone in town. Smuggled goods that are apprehended by customs officials and stored in the customs house are stolen back. Customs officials occasionally are grabbed, tarred, and feathered and paraded through the streets. There's a line in the book in which one of the sort of grand ironies is this, is that one of the hotbeds for this activity is Newport, Rhode Island, right? One of the customs officials says he's never met a more piratical people than the people of Newport. There's also legal challenges. There's a bunch of cases in which colonial lawyers essentially challenge the Crown's ability to do this. And John Adams talks about one famous case, a man by the name of James Otis Jr., who'd actually been a lawyer for the Crown, who switches sides to defend smugglers. And he has this sort of famous 5-hour oratory essentially talking about the invasion of the invasion of privacy, the insult to autonomy and sovereignty represented by the incursions of the Crown. And Adams, recalling later in his life, would say this of this. He says, "Every man out of an immense crowded audience appeared to go away as I did, ready to take arms against writs of assistance. Then and there was the first scene of the first act of opposition to the arbitrary rule of Great Britain. Then and there the child independence was born." That's about policing that he's talking about. He's talking about law enforcement, right? The British Crown keeps escalating. They find that they don't have the wherewithal with their customs officials to enforce the law, so they bring into it the Navy. They, in modern parlance, militarize the police. Now naval vessels are stopping and searching smugglers and non-smugglers. And here's what Benjamin Franklin says about this new initiative by the Crown to bring in the Navy to enforce the customs law. He writes, "Convert the brave, honest officers of your Navy into pimping tide waiters and colony officers of the customs. Let those who in the time of war fought gallantly in defense of their countrymen in peace be taught to prey upon it. Let them scour with armed boats every bay, harbor, river, creek, cove, or nook throughout your colonies, stop and detain every coaster, every wood boat, every fisherman. Thus shall the trade of your colonists suffer more from their friends in time of peace than it did from their enemies in war. Oh," he concludes, "this will work admirably." In the Declaration of Independence, there's a line by Thomas Jefferson that I had never noticed, though like any school child and student of American history, I'd read the Declaration, in which he's listing the things that the Crown has done, the evils committed by King George. And one of his complaints is that he has established all these new offices, and he says he has sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance, which is Jeffersonese for fuck the police. You're probably familiar with the story of a man named Eric Garner in New York City. Eric Garner was, we would call him a hustler, right? engaged in all kinds of essentially gray market business activity. One of the things he did in the neighborhood in Staten Island where he lived was he sold Lucy's, right? Single cigarettes. Selling single cigarettes is a violation of the tariff and duty law of the state. It's an evasion of them. That was his infraction. And under New York City's broken windows theory, under its policing of disorder, under its theory that minor infractions lead to larger ones, police would routinely ticket and arrest Eric Garner for that. And on the day he died, on the day he was killed, put into a chokehold by a New York City police officer, he said to the officer in the final monologue, before he said, "I can't breathe" 9 times, he said, "Every time you see me, you want to come harass me." He has sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. Every time you see me, you want to harass me. And it ends today. The project of the book, A Colony and a Nation, is understanding how we built the system we did, why we built the system we did, and to try to argue to people that the current system we do have, the sprawling region that I call the nation, places like here where we stand today, places where law enforcement, policing, and criminal justice function a little like the operating system on your laptop, in the background, right? The ideal number of interactions to have with the police is 0, right? In an ideal world, right, you're not the victim of a crime, you're not perpetrating a crime, you're not the suspect of a crime, no one you know is a victim of a crime, no one you know is suspected of committing a crime, no one you know is perpetrating a crime, right? Maybe like a traffic cop here and there when an intersection gets jammed. And by and large, in the nation, that's sort of how it operates. But there are huge swaths of this country in which the first-person experience of citizenship is circumscribed in a way that is fundamentally antithetical to our shared democratic commitments, to our shared vision of liberty, to the ideals the founders spilled their blood for. Huge swaths of what I call the colony, in which the police system functions like a computer virus. It interrupts, it disrupts, it interferes. It's constantly there in the way of you living your life, in which the sheer number of interactions is incalculable. That system was brought about by democratic means. You know, there's some things that happen in politics, like my favorite example is the bankruptcy bill, that, you know, there's no democratic will for it, right? That was just special interests and lobby groups and back deals strong-arming members of Congress to basically pass a bill that made it worse to be in bankruptcy. But that's not the case with the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system that we have today wasn't brought about backroom deals. It wasn't brought about through special interests or by lobbyists. It was brought about through democratic force. It was thousands and thousands and tens of thousands and millions of individual decisions by voters and city council members and state reps and state senators and elected district attorneys and governors and attorneys general and members of Congress and members of the Senate and United States presidents and U.S. attorneys, all moving in the same direction for a 30-year period that constructed the largest prison system in the world, right? So the project of this book is not to talk about necessarily programmatically how that got built, but what was driving all of that, right? If you think about all these different legal regimes that constitute the criminal justice system, like little iron filings that have been drawn into a kind of tyrannical alignment by some powerful propulsive magnetic force at the core, what is that force? What's doing the work there, right? And what I argue in the book is that that force is white fear. And that white fear is a powerful inheritance of this country from the first day of the first diary entry from the captain of the ship that landed on Jamestown, who writes, "The savages set upon us immediately," to the stories that would run in Southern newspapers in the antebellum South of slave rebellions, warning owners of the danger that lurked in conspiracy in the fields, to the calls for law and order and get tough on crime of the drug thugs, to calls for a border wall. There's something so powerful, something so shared in our cultural inheritance, to be offered some way of ordering the disordered, of protecting and preserving some security that we have in our spaces, even if it comes at the expense of installing something that looks like a colony or colonial occupation for other people. It's a seductive promise that offered, and it's not just a seductive promise that's been offered to Trump voters. It's a seductive promise to people in this room. It was a seductive promise to New York City liberals who elected Rudy Giuliani when I was 12 and 13 years old. Right? So the project of this book is to do something where that emotional core of that magnetic force that's so powerful, what I call in the book, like enriching political uranium. To do a thing where people who read the book can come to recognize when it's playing inside them. I'll use another Marin County-friendly analogy here. In cognitive behavioral therapy, the idea, right, is that you have these mental processes that sort of run in the background that can produce anxiety or depression or neuroses. And the project is to identify them so that you sort of call them forward and interrogate them. Right? And for me, the project of this book and the project to sort of reform in this particular area of creating a kind of democratic, egalitarian, flourishing society is to do the same thing with that impulse that we all have. And by we, I mean white people. I'm speaking for myself here. And if anyone needs to know how high the stakes are for that project, right, look no further than the White House. All right, with that, I'll take some questions.
I've done this a few times, but I've never had so many questions. So thank you, Chris, for making us think and making us wonder. I have quite a few questions that ask, are there politicians on the right who will think about what's going on and be likely to change? What do you think?
It's a great question. You know, there's been some movement at the sort of think tank level among conservatives towards criminal justice reform. There's this kind of right on crime coalition. Rand Paul actually has talked about this. The Koch brothers have actually put some money into this, getting rid of like cash bail, right? This is a huge number of people in this country who are in jail who haven't been convicted of anything. They're there because they can't pay to get out. And in fact, Rand Paul talks about Khalif Browder, who was a young man who died in Rikers, who killed himself after being in Rikers for a year for allegedly stealing a backpack. So I think there's some movement there. The problem is that the politics at the base of it have to be addressed. There's a sort of idea that like you can put together a kind of like Cato Institute, Koch brothers, think tank consensus, but that's not going to be strong enough to take on that kind of emotional pull.
One of the things that you've shown so beautifully on your show are the town halls and the discussions with politicians. Do you think that will continue, and how can we probably don't need to do it here, but what can people here do? We do need to deal with a lot, so
Yeah.
what can people here do?
There's a few things. I mean, I think that there's a lot of folks that have written great stuff that's much more programmatic than this book. So there's a book out called Unwarranted by Barry Friedman that's about policing. It's got some really specific recommendations. The other thing I would say is a lot of this stuff happens at the local level. Like, we elect county prosecutors, okay? Prosecutors have tremendous discretion in administering the system. And they're often elected in very, 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 very low turnout elections, right? Which means you can have a big role in those elections. It's the same for state reps and state senators, right? Those state reps and state senators, like, where are they on these issues of criminal justice reform, right? Because those are also low turnout elections, and this state in particular has had one of the most punitive attitudes towards this problem of any state in the country for years. So if you invest yourself in these sort of local elections, city council elections, particularly electing prosecutors, that's the one thing I try to hammer into everyone. Prosecutors matter. If your prosecutor's running unopposed, find someone to run against him or her. Even if they don't win. It changes the political incentives. For years, it's all been a one-way ratchet. The only thing you're scared of is not being tough enough. You're scared of the Willie Horton ad. You're scared of the didn't convict this person who went out and then committed this horrible act. That's the entire incentive structure, right? You need to create political incentive structures on the other side.
I have several questions about your college days because we have quite a few students here, and some of us have read that you were not particularly always vegan, undrinking, unpot smoking at Brown, and yet nothing happened to you. Can you compare that to what happens to people who might be living in a different world?
Yeah, one of the parts of the book is about college and about the ways in which we actually have self-contained little worlds of elite justice. They're called college campuses. And on those college campuses, the approach to this stuff is very different. It's remarkably forgiving, right? I mean, who's going to send their kid to a school where they might get a record and 6 months for marijuana possession? Would anyone do that? No, you don't want that, right? So it was the same thing at Brown. You know, I was in a dorm room one night smoking pot with a friend, and a cop came in. He was a Brown University police officer, and we got all panicked, and then he looked at us and said, "Oh, is this Eric B. Rakim?" It's like, "I love this album." It's like, "Yeah, dude, me too." And then he left. Right? The point that I'm trying to make in talking about campus justice, right, is that if you take the theory of broken windows and apply it to a college campus, there would seem to be a lot of disorder there. Like, go to Madison, Wisconsin on game day. Okay? Like a Big Ten school on game day, drug consumption, alcohol consumption, drunk driving, public urination, actual broken windows, right? All of these sort of signs of disorder, but in some ways the entire four-year college experience is a way of kind of like managing disorder. I call it in the book like elite Rumspringa, right? Which is the Amish tradition where people are sort of let to go and sort of indulge everything, and then they end up coming back to the fold. That that our conceptions of order on a college campus are very different than our conception of order in, say, East Harlem, right? And why is that? Policing those two places is very different, and I don't want to like overdraw the parallels, but we should think about what we mean when we say order.
You mentioned prosecutors, and I have about 5 questions asking if you think there will be a special prosecutor.
All right. You guys are all like, yeah, your book, but. Don't applaud that much. That's supposed to be a no. I have to say about everything related to Russia, people say, well, what do you think? Where's it going? What's your gut? And I feel, I don't know. I go back and forth. Sometimes it feels like it's something bigger than Watergate. Other times it feels like maybe it's like a weird, more like Whitewater. Like there's a lot of sketchy stuff, but no thing there in the middle. Nunes as chair of the committee, I think, is untenable, particularly as pursuing the investigation, and that becomes clearer and clearer every day. So I think I don't think they can keep this up that much longer. Part of the problem too is they just keep getting revealed to having not told the truth, having either lied or not disclosed. So there's just this sort of mounting sense that, well, maybe it's all innocent, but you sure as hell are covering up a lot of stuff. In terms of special prosecutors, it's a little hard to imagine the chain of events that brings it about, right? Because that would be appointed by Sessions' deputy, who is yet to be confirmed, who is widely respected and might do that, but I think some new set of facts would probably have to arise to bring that about. But the broader thing is like, this is not going away anytime soon.
Getting back to the book, a couple of people asked, are there any recent events that should give us hope? We're all going through despair, and as we read your book, we see great things happening, but also terrible things. And today, Sylvia Borstein writes about today's lowering of the EPA standards. It feels as if there's everything going against our being able to accomplish what we want to when we read this book.
I am a little contrarian on this. I'm not on the EPA standards, which are an unmitigated disaster. But I think that the last 2 months have been remarkable in a lot of ways. I think it's reinvigorated civil society. I think they've done real damage in who they've appointed and the executive order, but they've also lost every big fight they picked. And that's a big deal. I don't think people should feel like people that oppose, and I don't want to presume the politics of people in the room, people that oppose Trump and his agenda and the Republican Party more broadly, I think should feel pretty encouraged about how effective mobilization, public persuasion, all the basic tools of civil society have been. And I think that extends to the stuff I read about in the book as well.
It's a fabulous book. I don't want to give away the ending, but do not stop before you get there. It is profound, and it will make you think every time you pick up your phone, too. But we have a lot of questions about your show, and I know that you've heard from me that Rachel's father is here. And
yeah, where is?
Thank you. Where is? Yay! thank you for raising that amazing woman. And but several people want to know, you're here right now.
Yes.
You have another lecture tonight. You have a show in between. We know you're young and strong, but how in the world do you do this?
I'm barely hanging on, guys. To be honest, I have no idea what I just said. No, I mean, I'm basically 90% caffeine at this point. I have an amazing staff. Today is the hardest day I have because I had a 5:45 car. I flew in. I did 2 interviews with 2 things with Robert Reich. I'm doing this event, then I go do the show, then I do another event tonight. So today's the hardest. My staff is picking up the slack, and I'm normally it would be incomprehensible on a normal day that I would be this detached from today's editorial process. So I've been checking in on email, and I called in and sort of catching as catch can. So a big part of what allows me to do is I have an incredible staff who are extremely, extremely talented and smart and diligent and hardworking. So they sort of are making this possible. So shout out to them.
Well, having said that, we're all going to be watching the show tonight, and we're going to be watching it forever with different eyes because we're going to remember this day when we got to be in here. And we aren't going to call you Lamb Chop because we notice Rachel doesn't do that anymore.
I'm a grown-ass man.
But we really want to thank you. And there are over 700 of us here. So we are going, and everybody has a book. So in a couple of minutes, we're going to bring out a table. Chris is going to sign. He's so gracious, he's going to personalize. I beg you not to ask him to write anything more than a name. Otherwise, the people behind you will either not get their book signed or you won't have a show to watch tonight. So
yeah, we got to move this through this like an arraignments at a misdemeanor court.
Right.
Okay, we got to move the bodies through.
Right. Except that you think these are people, not bodies.
Right. Yes, of course.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Chris.
Thank you very much.